Said you've been over before, haven't you?
Yes.
So what's it like?
You don't want to think about it. Keep your mind on the job.
No, I mean, is it scary?
Yes, it is. You don't have time to be frightened for long. It's too strange. When you go over the top, you're in another world.
Welcome back, young scholars. This is the second video on World War I. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video and the previous video were: what were the immediate and main causes of World War I? How was World War I different from previous wars and how was it similar? And then what were the significant effects of World War I? So how was World War I different from previous wars and how is it similar? First of all, in terms of similarities, World War I is a bit of a misleading name for this war. World War I was actually the second global war. The first was the 7 Years' War that was fought in the 1750s between Great Britain and France. And it was fought not only in Europe, but also in various colonial territories, including in the Americas and in Asia. World War I, though, was a global war, and that is a really critical thing that you need to be aware of. So there were colonial troops from all the various colonies of the major European powers. There were troops from Africa, there were troops from Australia and India, China, Southeast Asia. They all took part in this conflict. It was a global conflict. And you can see here there was propaganda that was used in order to recruit soldiers from the various colonies. So in this particular advertisement, you can see Australia has promised Britain 50,000 kangaroos, or maybe men. In order to get soldiers in the colonies, European powers oftentimes gave them the impression that once the war was over, that they would be given their independence, their freedom. And as we'll find out later on, that never actually happened between World War I and World War II. So many soldiers signed up. You can see images like this, right, where you have soldiers from Africa where there was fighting between colonies. So there were, for instance, German colonies in Africa right next to French and British colonies. And so not surprising, at the borders of those colonies, there was fighting that took place. And so if you get an image like this on the AP test, do not hesitate and think, well, that can't be World War I because World War I was only fought between white people. No, absolutely not correct. There was fighting that took place in Africa, fighting that took place in the South Pacific. An important event that occurred in the middle of World War I was the Armenian Genocide. This is something that very few Americans actually know, frankly, much about. So the Armenian Genocide took place in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were ultimately fearful of a minority population called Armenians who were predominantly Christian. They were fearful that they were working with Russians. So remember, the Ottoman Empire was on the Central Power side. The Russians were on the side of the Allies. And so they were fearful that this Armenian population may have more in common, since they were both predominantly Eastern Orthodox Christian, with the Russians, that they were working with the Russians to undermine the Ottomans. And so the Ottomans called for the mass extermination of 1.5 million Armenians in 1915, one of the great genocides in world history, along with, we discussed the Congolese genocide in period 5 and period 6. This was actually probably most similar to the Holocaust because this was a genocide that occurred in the context of the war. We could also, though, compare it to the Cambodian genocide or the Rwandan genocide, which we'll study in period 6. Now, the reason that Americans probably know less about this genocide is, in fact, American presidents haven't even recognized this as a genocide. And the reason for that is because Turkey, which is the country that emerged out of the Ottoman Empire, does not want these atrocities brought up, and we are friends with Turkey, so we don't want to say anything to offend Turkey, so we have refused, as of yet, to call this a genocide. This became a big deal a couple of years back. We're at the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, and the Pope came out and said, yes, this was a genocide. It was an event where many Christians were killed, and he called upon President Obama to recognize this as a genocide, and President Obama did not. So as a result of the Armenian Genocide, and you can see again the pockets of Armenians that were predominantly in the eastern region of Anatolia and Turkey, and they were in many cases forced to move and flee. There was mass migration, as is always the case with major genocides. Now, another concept to be familiar with coming out of World War I is the concept of total war. So warfare really placed demands on nearly every aspect of society, including the home front. And so maybe you've seen these images, for example, in American Studies class, showing propaganda where they were trying to encourage people at the home front to eat more cottage cheese, for example, because it supplies more protein than meat. So they want to eat less meat because they're sending meat to the front lines for the soldiers, or encouraging women to sign up in nursing professions to become part of the war effort, or to increasingly grow and can your own food so that sufficient food could be sent again to the front lines. So recall when the war broke out, the Germans had invaded northern France, and this led to the formation of the Western Front. The French and the British then responded. Well, then the Germans attacked the Russians, and this led to the formation of the Eastern Front. Well, 1917 became a really important year in the war. So the war dragged on for 3 years, and then in 1917, a series of important events took place. First, as a result of just incredibly high casualty rates, the people of Russia became very upset and anxious about the progress of the war, and eventually Russia pulls out of the war due to a revolution that's taking place in 1917. So following the Communist Revolution, Russia signs a peace treaty with Germany, and Russia drops out of the war. And this allows Germany and Austria-Hungary to refocus its energies on the Western Front. Well, at the same time that the Russians were dropping out of the war, the Americans were getting in the war. And the Americans ultimately are going to tip the balance of power in favor of the Allies. It had really been a stalemate up to that point between the central powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and Great Britain and France and Italy. So the reason why the United States got involved in World War I was predominantly because of unrestricted submarine warfare. So the Germans had restarted unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. The United States made it very clear that they were not supplying weapons and ammunition to the Allies, when in actuality there is significant evidence proving that wasn't actually the case. So the U.S. entered the war after the Germans restart unrestricted submarine warfare. The other thing the Germans did was they sent a telegram to Mexico, a diplomat in Mexico, letting the Mexicans know that if they got involved in the war on the side of the Central Powers, that once the war was concluded, that the land that had been taken by the Americans in the Mexican-American War, which would include parts of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California, would be returned to Mexico. That was the offer that was made by the Germans to the Mexicans. In 1918, the Central Powers agreed to an armistice ending the war. So the war ends in 1918 after an armistice, after the United States again sort of joins up with the Allied powers and tips the balance of power in favor of the Allies. The war ultimately devastates European economies, but at the same time it boosts the U.S. economies, right? War production is incredibly economically beneficial, right? You're pumping out supplies, you're pumping out things that are necessary to fight in the war, and that ultimately is going to rev up the economy. And because none of the fighting takes place on U.S. soil, they don't experience anything in the way of significant property damage. There's some loss of life, but not a significant amount of loss of life compared to what happened to European economies. So economies like France, which were significantly destroyed, there was significant property damage, there was significant debts that had been accrued by the French in fighting this war for 4 long years. There were also some significant boundary changes that took place as a result of the war. So, for example, out of what was the former Russian Empire, you had new countries form, like Poland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up into Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the formation of the modern-day country of Turkey, and we'll talk more about the Middle Eastern countries in a later video. The German Empire doesn't change in a significant way. They lose some territory to France here on the boundary, but generally speaking, Germany is not as significantly punished as some nations like France wanted. Right? Some nations like France were advocating for Germany to be broken up, and it wasn't in fact broken up, but it did experience significant loss of territory in its colonies. So for example, in places like the German colonies in Africa, which were taken and then controlled by the League of Nations as mandates. So new states emerge out of Central Europe based upon the principle of self-determination, right? This was something the US was calling for, that this argument that these people should have the right to ultimately form their own countries and govern themselves. And so that's what happens to the former regions of Austria-Hungary and also the former portions of Russia that had gained their independence. Now, another important effect of World War I was its impact on women. As the men were away fighting in the war, women were increasingly gaining respect as they were engaging increasingly in factory employment. And shortly after the war, it is when women gained the right to vote. So you'll recall the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in the United States. That was passed and ratified in 1919 and then 1920, and that was, again, 1 or 2 years after the war. So after watching this video and the last video, you should be able to answer these big questions. First, what were the immediate and main causes of World War I? How was World War I different from previous wars, and how is it similar? And what were the significant effects of World War I? Thanks for watching.